What I'd like to do today is give you an idea of something called single loop learning and double loop learning. This is basically two different strategies for engaging problems that we may discover in our workplaces, in our families, basically in life in general. The first strategy, called single loop learning, addresses the way that we solve most of the problems that we encounter in life. If it's dark when you enter a room, you turn on the light switch. Problem solved. If something is broken, we fix it. And that kind of behavior can actually become very addictive. It gives us a feeling of success and production. Those of us that are more inclined toward efficiency feel like the quicker we can solve problems, the better. And so we look for very simple ways and very quick ways to solve those problems. And this strategy, as I said, works in most situations or in very simple situations. The problem arises when we continue to do things the same way and we run into a problem. It's not working. Often what we'll do is we will begin to blame people. Well, let's say, for example, you have a problem in your work environment of somebody being chronically tardy to work. And so their manager has gone to them and said, this is a problem, and we feel as a staff it's been addressed. And then comes the next event or the next meeting, the person is tardy again, and we think, well, the reason they're tardy is because their boss did not communicate it effectively. So we begin to put blame on other people. In this case, we would blame the boss. Meanwhile, the boss is probably thinking, I solved the problem the best I could. I don't know what else I can do. So we run into a bind. What Chris Argyris figured out is that left unchecked, this is an instinctual thing that organizations will do. They will respond to a problem, take action. If it solves the problem, great. If not, we try something else. And we figure that what we must not have been able to do is address what the problem was. So again, this is very addictive. This is very common in most places. I think it starts when we're really young. Oftentimes parents want to give quick answers to their children on how to solve a problem. I certainly have noticed that this is very prevalent in education. And now, as we're shifting toward a more holistic approach to education, there's a lot of pushback. For example, this is probably a good example of single loop learning. When it comes to teaching something like multiplication, most of us were taught a very routinized way of doing a multiplication problem. Let's say a two-digit times two-digit type multiplication problem. You start on the right, you do that, you move to the left. That whole structure is the way we solve the problem. What they're finding in education is that obviously those that know something about mathematics say that there are really more ways than that one rote way of learning multiplication. And actually there are many ways to multiply. And so, but if a parent has learned that that's the only way, and in school they're being introduced to a different way, they begin to put blame on the educators for not teaching it in the way that's the most simple or the most direct. Instead, they're introducing these crazy ways of children being able to multiply, or what they perceive as crazy ways. So this creates a whole situation where parents aren't trusting teachers. Teachers are being frustrated and trying to explain things to their parents in their classroom. So single loop learning, although it's addictive and although it's easy, it can create some real stressors in environments, in organizations. So what Chris Argyris figured out was that if we could move toward a different way of learning, double loop learning, then we would maybe get ourselves out of that trap of single loop learning. So one of the things to know about double loop learning is that it follows the same beginning. We respond to a problem, we think we have a solution, And we begin to apply that solution. And when we find out that it doesn't work, the invitation is to look at what else might be contributing to this situation. What are we missing? And so you can begin to ask different questions. So what I'm going to do is actually try to give you a real life example of this so that you can see how it plays out. I'm on a parish staff, and we're a staff of about 13 people. And from the day I started 18 plus years ago, the expectation was that there would be monthly staff meetings. I never questioned that. I think it was just an assumption that this is a time that we all, check in with one another and with our pastor, and monthly staff meetings really, that was the expectation. I have worked under two different pastors. Our first pastor, his approach to staff meetings was much like our current one, and that is that he would lead the meeting generally. He would say, this is what I want us to talk about, and after he made some announcements, he may look for a little bit of feedback, but once he made his announcements, then the typical mode was that everyone at the table would then report on what's going on in their particular department, their division. In our case, we call it our ministry. And that's pretty much how they went. It wasn't necessarily a place of sharing for ideas. There wasn't an expectation that the staff meeting could be anything other than what it was. About probably 6 months to a year ago, I noticed that there was a certain level of stress that happened during the staff meetings. Our pastor would mention to everybody what the agenda items were. Actually, we were asked ahead of time if we had an agenda item. And what an agenda item was a topic that would impact more than just ourselves. So we would submit our agenda items, and the pastor would bring them up at the meeting and then have a discussion. And we would generally try to come to some sort of conclusion or on the issue, and then we would move on. But I could tell that there was something about the formality of agenda items. There were some issues with whether or not people considered what they wanted to ask about, whether it was an agenda item or whether it was just a report that they would give on their particular ministry. There was some confusion about the term. And so there was just a lot of confusion about it. And also, as people would leave the meeting, some kind of negative feelings about how it went and whether they were heard. And I sensed a little discomfort from our pastor in having to lead the meeting, and in terms of the formality, the way it has always been done. And so I began to ask different questions. So just to reframe this, the single loop learning part was that even though it was uncomfortable, and we had several meetings where people left feeling that the meeting wasn't a real comfortable environment for them, we still kept having the monthly meetings with the same format, doing it the same way, people uncomfortable afterwards, people confused afterwards, the following month wondering what's an agenda item, etc. And we just kind of kept turning the wheel and doing things the same way, expecting a different result, which, as Einstein said, is kind of crazy. So that's single loop learning. So as I began to learn about double loop learning, I began to question, who said that staff meetings needed to be run in this way, with the pastor asking for agenda items, with people wondering what is an agenda item and what is a report. And I began to ask the questions why. And this is really the crux of double loop learning. So I began to ask questions and check my assumptions and other people's assumptions about what a staff meeting is and why we have it, and why do we have it in the way that we have it. So I went to our pastor and I said, tell me something about your experience with meetings, either as a participant or as a facilitator of a meeting. Have you ever been to a meeting maybe that's different, that's run differently than the way we've been running our staff meetings. And what I learned was in most of the meetings that he attends, the purpose of a meeting is for somebody to come and give them information. It isn't about coming to collaborative agreements on things, decision making and all of that. And I also mentioned to him that I noticed that when people would bring up things, whether it was an agenda item or their report, and it involved some sort of a decision, there was some reluctance on his part and some stress about making a decision right away. And I asked him if he thought that at meetings, decisions needed to be made and definitively decided at a meeting. And he said he sort of felt that pressure. And I said, well, what if when we had our meetings, we made it okay for you not to have a decision for us at that point, or that we wouldn't decide things at that meeting, but that we would just introduce them and give people a chance to think about it, knowing that, though, there would be some follow-up, because I thought that piece was important for me. And he sort of liked that idea. And I said, and what if we don't have agenda items? I mean, what would it look like if we didn't have agenda items and instead we just gave everybody around the table a chance to share about their ministry and perhaps ask a question that might involve input from everybody else? And so I thought maybe we would walk away from the meeting differently if we tried that. And so, I tested some assumptions with him. I came to this idea that we would try this. And so the next staff meeting, he came to us and said, I'm aware that maybe my demeanor changes during meetings, and what I'd like to do is change the way we do these meetings, and how about we go around the table? And we did that, and my takeaway was that it felt pretty good. It was nice to try something different. And I asked people afterwards how they felt about that meeting, and they felt that it was one of our better meetings. And so I think that this is the value of double loop learning, is that we can get ourselves out of a rut. And there was nothing in there about blame, about blaming somebody for the meeting being unproductive, or blaming each other for not contributing toward a more collaborative approach. So I think that's the value of single loop and double loop learning, that we begin to, in that double loop learning, that we actually, use single loop for things like light bulbs needing to be replaced and very simple things. We're going to do that. But when we hit a bind, that we begin to explore this idea of double loop learning and really ask some deep questions about why have we done this, and can we do it differently, and making that okay. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea of the value of double loop learning and why we might want to engage that kind of behavior in our groups.